23. The Pythia's Curse. She watched them as they came and went. Some of them she knew, others were strange. They barely interested her. Today it was Lord Doubtroyal from the Court of Principals. He brought petitions from across the Empire. There were calls for military aid which needed her seal, demands for independence from the Orbert cluster. The Council would find ways around this. They would sustain her. She was sacred, and her cook and her latest taster were trustworthy. As long as she endured, she was still the figurehead. They said that civil unrest was mounting against her. The people would not do that. She was their Pythia, their guardian. The Admiralty was in a dudgeon over restrictions placed on the space fleets. The hero Pridonius had publicly denounced the Pythia in council, pledging his allegiance to the Rassilon clique. Pridonius had always sulked like a spoiled brat, but he was popular and therefore dangerous politically. In an unprecedented gesture of esteem, the Council of Principals created him a hereditary noble and packed him off to Thunderil on the asteroid archipelago. Conveniently far out. She approved of that. He was to act as an independent observer in some minor territorial dispute between Ruta III and the Sontara Warburg. If she still had her powers, of course, she would have foreseen the situation and headed it off long before. In the circumstances, the Council were handling events better than she had imagined. Rassilon had been held under house arrest, accused of misappropriation of academia revenues. The charges were trumped up, of course, but the investigation forestalled his plans for a while. They would never hold. The little man's political record was impeccable, but she knew he was not to be trusted. He had stolen her steel comb. "Excellency, we must have your decision." The tedious Lord Doubtroyal was droning at her from just below her basket. His cowl was pushed disrespectfully back so that she could see his pudgy grey face. Beside him, muttering in his ear, was her personal physician. They stared at her as if she were a curio in the Academia library. "Highness, you must name a successor. The Constitution is adamant on this point." So that was their scheme. Once they had a successor, they could be rid of her. She had chosen long ago, but there was an impediment. That was why they waited. Doubtroyal and the physician looked as if they would never leave. They irritated her. "Her name, Highness. One name, one word, then, for the security of the future." He was clutching the reliquary of accession, defiling with his man's hands the Epiphany scrolls of Son Uremus. Ancient sacraments entrusted to the 217th Pythia in the sacred fire lake of Ragfingish. What did she care? Next they would bring out the invisible armour of Troppelsaber or the holy icons of the bright past. Finally, the great book of future legends itself. She spat, picked up her bowl of fish tongues and flung it at him. After that they left her alone for the day. No more dispatches to ignore, or strangers who stared. They were all ushered out of the cavern, and Handstrong barred the door. She picked at the weavework of her basket and counted the talismans on her robe, waiting for the evening devotions to begin in the temple above. Living from moment to moment, each one an achievement, where once she had seen all that would be and marked time as it passed. At the stroke of the crepuscular gong, she heard a side gate to the cavern sing on its hinges. A figure emerged from the shadows. One of her older votresses, wearing muddy sandals and wrapped in the fur robe of a market trader. From her sleeve she drew out a small casket. "As you commanded, venerable one?" "Let me see it." Handstrong came from his cell, carrying a pole fixed with brass fingers. The digits grasped the casket as the Groladian raised the contraption up towards the Pythia. A rough box with a worn Leviahide binding, profane that so precious an item should be smuggled out in such a package. Yet she could feel its power before she even raised the lid. The eye stared up at her from a cushion of red silk, a globe of mottled amber streaked with a single black slit. The eye of the Sphinx. She was sure that the pupil contracted as it was exposed to the light. She lifted it up gently, and it weighed heavily in her hand. "How much?" she thought. 20,000 treasons, Highness." "What does one expect from common thieves and cut-purses? It will be missed from the library. The Council Police Contingent has always been a prime beneficiary of the Temple Welfare Trust. I have been their matron for many years." She cupped the glistening eye in her hands, feeling its peculiar energy diffusing through her brittle bones and dry sinews. "Begone!" she said aloud. The votress bowed and left the cavern. Handstrong remained, awaiting orders. "I said, begone!" she cried. She must be alone at this moment. The torchlight painted the cavern of prophecy with gold and black shadow. Water oozed on the sooty rock walls. The age-old legacy of time gathered in this place like dripped tallow from a candle. It had been the hub of the Empire since the beginning, and she was the core. The guardian and embodiment of that heritage, the unsullied symbol of the world's fertility. She was Gallifrey. Without her, the world and its empire would slowly die an ageless living death. That was her curse, and she laid it on Rassilon and all his followers. Even as her guard slipped away, she opened her hands and looked into the depths of the Sphinx's eye. At the gate of the future, the light was hazy. The wheeling birds cried hungrily overhead. She stepped forward and pressed against the bronze doors. They would not yield. Mocking faces looked out from the grilles. As she reached for the doors again, one moved of its own accord. A blade of the darkness beyond slowly widened as the door ground its way open. A cowled figure with a flaming torch stood in the archway. "Who do you seek?" he said. There had never been a gatekeeper before. "I seek my successor," she declared. "He must be found." "Come through," he said, "if you dare." He stood back to let her pass, but she faltered. A cold wind was blowing into her face from the future. The doctor or the kid? There was no choice, no time to think. Ace nearly gave up on them both. Across the street, the process was slithering towards the child. He had edged backwards until he had pinned himself to a wall, transfixed like a frightened rabbit in the eye of an advancing snake. She snatched up an umbrella and ran at the leech. She kept yelling at the kid to get clear, but he was too terrified to move. Holding the umbrella like a two-handled broadsword, she beat at the monster's rippling flanks. The process ignored the attack, intent on catching at least one victim. It reared over the kid, spluttering triumphantly. Ace pulled out the second test tube of her new Nitro 10. "Get clear!" she yelled at him. "Shonzi, get down!" The kid's own name brought him out of it. He ducked low and darted clear along the street. The process lunged after him. Ace flung the nitro. The process took the full force of the blast. It screamed. A spray of grit and black blood hit Ace across the face. When the smoke and dust cleared, the creature lay in a twisted mound at the edge of the bomb crater. Ace wanted to yell, "Ace, Dragon Slayer!" but the excitement came in cold fizzes and she felt sickened. She was blooded. The kid was standing a couple of yards away. Ace reached out and hugged him tightly. She rocked him for a moment and kissed his head. Her tears were soaking them both. She wiped her face with her sleeve, and he eased gently away from her. He pulled a biscuit out of his pocket and planted it into her hand. Then he ran, vanishing into the deepening gloom. The stars were clustered closer, as if the sky was shrinking. Their fading light had become thin and brittle. Ace ached with weariness all over, and she was on her own again. "I never thanked you, did I?" Shonzi had said. "When I was a kid and you saved my life." The kid had nowhere to run to. His future was already walking round as a beetlehead. Time was tangled, but she was going to cut through the knot. She needed Shonzi back. She stopped herself just in time. She was almost going to say death is no obstacle. She had to find the doctor too, but she was so exhausted. It was easier to sit and do nothing. The doctor always muddled through. He made an art form out of it. She eyed the lifeless body of the process. It took up half the street where it lay. Its fins still twitched occasionally with final reflex actions. Supposing the doctor was still 2 biscuits short of a tin, not yet the doctor at all. He'd never go off willingly with Vale. Vale was grinning. It had been a trick. Sooner or later the doctor's genius was going to run out, taking his luck with it. Shonzi, not her, had been entrusted with all the TARDIS's information, and now he had gone too. Better if he'd been killed outright. Something glinted in the shadows across the street. A clump of the squat plants that were coming up everywhere had produced a cluster of flowers. They shimmered like little diamond glowworms. A tiny alcove was moulded into the wall nearby. Ace found a sharp stone and scratched the word Shonzi on the fascia above the alcove. She broke the kid's biscuit and laid half of it inside. Then she picked a few of the glowing flowers and put them with the rest of her offering. Just a little act of faith. The next best thing to a funeral pyre. She'd always been the same over friends. Next, it was find the doctor. She sat against the wall while she ate the rest of the biscuit. It tasted of honey and cream flavoured with lemon. The air was warm, and the city creaked as it rocked her to sleep. Asleep on an open street near the twitching hulk of the monster. Vale kept his hand firmly on the doctor's arm. The guard outside had halted right by the entrance to the broken tower. It had stopped chittering as it hunted, alert to the slightest sound in the empty arteries. Worse, Vale knew that it was the guard he was destined to become. If memories of the new now supplanted those already in the guard's head, then they were in real danger. If its mind existed inside the helmet at all, it would never forget where it had caught its younger self. They had headed for the Mercury Stream in the first phase of the city. Vale kept insisting that Ace had been right behind them when they started. She would make for the first phase too, and they would meet her there. Vale is all right. He'll help you. Lucky you found him. He slipped pockets of assurance into the doctor's thoughts. Easy enough to do, since the strange man's mind was teeming with layer upon layer of information, more than any brain could logically deal with, most of it disordered and incomprehensible. When they had seen the guard on the street ahead, they had ducked into the tower and crouched in its shadows. The tower was creaking gently. Vale had heard the sound from other buildings they had passed, as if the city was stirring from a long sleep, or in its slow death throes. A new silvery light was filtering in from the street. The guard's footsteps swished closer in the covering of plants. Vale's hand squeezed the doctor's arm tighter. He was not going to lose his ticket of passage out of this dying prison world. He listened to the thoughts tumbling in the doctor's head, apparently oblivious of the danger. One name suddenly surfaced that startled Vale, a name he had completely forgotten. Rassilon. The black shape of the guard filled the doorway. A loud crash of falling masonry from somewhere nearby. The tower trembled, the guard chittered and vanished along the street. The doctor's thoughts still babbled into Vale's head, registering no reaction to their salvation at all. He squeezed the doctor's arm spitefully. It was rough and hard in his grasp. He was somehow holding a narrow stone column instead. The doctor had vanished, although his chaotic mind was still loud enough. The spiral stair was the only way he could have gone. Vale put out a junk thought, a tracker. Remember Rassilon. Rassilon? Said another voice. Vale choked. A thrill of cold terror ran through his body. An ever-present eye, long denied, was opening in his mind. An eye like a cat's. "So I find you skulking here at last," she said. "Vale, my pupil, what is this place? Who knows of Rassilon here? Tell me!" The Doctor tried to rail in his wandering thoughts, but the strangest notions kept popping into his head. It made him feel extremely uncomfortable. He needed Shonzi and Ace, although Vale, whom he did not trust, at least clarified a few matters. From a window near the top of the tower he saw the stars slowly glimmering out one by one. The enclosed sky was going dark. Above and below on the curving surface of his ship the streets were traced out as glowing lines in the darkness. Madavinia aridosa in flower, an iridescent desert flower that bloomed profusely after infrequent rainstorms, turning the Gallifreyan wastelands into starfields. Because of its brief and frantic lifespan, it was regularly used in scientific experiments and early space missions. He tried to concentrate. The whole environment was contracting, which accounted for the fresh tremors. Either this was the start of the process's new beginning, or his ship was dying. The TARDIS's inner dimensions were slowly compacting. The buildings in the city would soon be grinding themselves into each other. Eventually, it would crush them all. No sign of the cat or the banshee. The infinitely variable safeguards that Rassilon had installed in every TARDIS from the Type 1 were collapsing as well. The survival of the Doctor's ship rested solely with the Doctor, if the Doctor was ever restored again. The glowing crisscross of the streets below and the dimensional strings of the cat's cradle. The ancient Gallifreyans had excelled in interlacement, motifs interwoven under and above, back and forth until the start of the design was lost. Patterns and threads, ornate stone ridges on the great houses, intricate lines of coloured plants and soil in the knot gardens, polyphonic voices in the thought pool, repeated steps in the lordly dances, a net in which they were all entangled. The strings stretched across all time like a web. He had seen it reflected everywhere, from the rich patterns of the redoubtable Miss David's carpet shop in Antalya to the ration queues of Boom City after the great soul rush of 831 had failed. The universe was all enmeshed. Yet out of that chaotic fantasia of form, Rassilon had translated the TARDISes and fashioned the Matrix. Rassilon again. Remember Rassilon, the most celebrated of Gallifrey's heroes who led his world out of the dark time, the time of chaos. The architect of the modern world, whose father was a suet shredder. But that was the stuff of legend, millennia before the age into which the Doctor was born. One of 45 cousins from the loom of the gloomy house of Lungbarrow in the southern mountains. One of the accursed children of Rassilon. And Rassilon decreed that no Time Lord shall travel into Gallifrey's past. One of the laws of time. The Doctor had met him once, but that was in his tomb long after he had died. The past was always with the Time Lords, locked in their age-old stultified constitution, remembered in fragmentary race memory. Sometimes it came too close. The Doctor had also met Omega, another legendary hero. Poor Omega, whose vainglorious sacrifice had created the Time Lords and marked the point where Rassilon's intuitive revelation all started to go wrong. The start of the slow decline of Gallifrey. But these figures were both relics, no longer compatible in the modern universe. It was a chance encounter with the Book of the Old Time that had first nudged the Doctor's own thoughts back towards his world archae-barbaric past. A suspicion had been born in his mind that before regeneration there had been reincarnation. Some memories might be more racial inheritance. Nothing lasts that does not change. But the answer was beyond reach. To visit Gallifrey's past was the one rule he had never broken. Until now, when the opportunity presented itself before temptation had even set in. One word out of place to these Gallifreyans with whom he was trapped, one anachronistic slip, and the whole of that past and civilization might be smashed. And he, the Doctor, might cease to exist, just as Ryogas's own future self had been wiped away. He must resist. The tower shivered. Vale was standing beside him. "Tell me about it," said the young man. He had a feverish look about him. "This is no place to talk," replied the Doctor, and prepared to descend. The tower lurched. He stumbled to one side and found the narrow stairway blocked. Where are you going? Let me through, Vale. The whole area is becoming dimensionally unstable. He found his arm gripped again. Vale's hand was like a vice. Let go, Vale Vorionsty. You're going to help me get out of this place, Doctor. Impossible. No one can get out. You can. You're the only one with a ship. Another tremor ran up the tower. The Doctor glanced down from the window. I've no ship. It's all dying. There were guards grouping on the glowing street below. Wilby, croaked the captain. Escape. There is none. Come down. A crack ran up the walls. Vale's grip tightened. The Doctor ignored it. He squinted out through the darkening sky. The glimmering lines of the streets clearly showed up the inner curve of the world sphere. To the south, above them, there was a definite bulge in the cityscape. The ground was heaving upwards like the flank of a volcano when an eruption is imminent. No, Polly, shouted the Doctor. Then the tower, it'll bring you down. The captain turned, and its guards clustered around it. What do they mean? Said Vale. The Doctor stepped angrily back from the window. He hated days like this. Don't you know? He said. He disliked the young man's cold stare. A Capellian strabism, the wrong eyes in the wrong head. Whatever the final consequence, it was clear that no secrets could be kept from this young man. Vale had a power in him to manipulate and destroy. The Doctor sensed it seething just under the surface. It would undoubtedly lead to trouble. Vale was more dangerous, more potentially deadly than anyone the Doctor had ever met. It means trouble, said Vale. Take a look at the city. The dimensions are already collapsing. Any more flux will speed up the compaction. The processes won't have a world to usurp. Vale's cold eyes narrowed. A dangerous excitement tremored in his voice. This is your ship, he said slowly. The whole city. Yes, growled the Doctor, and Vale shrank before his authority. This is my ship, and its survival rests solely with me, not with you, Vale, nor with any other half-baked leech that gnaws and bleeds its systems. The tower shuddered and creaked. The staircase lurched. The Doctor stumbled and grabbed at the wall. It burned his hand. It was moving. The spiral stairway was starting to turn inside the tower's fixed shape. He moved in beside Vale, keeping clear of the walls as they ground slowly upwards past them. They're taking us down, Vale cried. The stairway moved like the thread of an unwinding screw. The Doctor turned and ran up the spiral. He heard Vale pounding up behind him. There's nowhere to go. Isn't there? He retorted, and came to a stop as they reached the broken top. The rubble-strewn platform was slowly sinking down through the shaft of the tower like a drowning carousel. Dust plumed down from the hollow walls in which it turned. Where now? Demanded Vale. The Doctor gazed up the dizzying length of the chimney. The silver shape was there, hovering high above the open mouth of the walls. This effort might drain the last of the power, but he had to try. Those cold eyes in Vale's head were watching every move, but it was unavoidable. There was no other chance. Pilot indent! The Doctor shouted. The silver frame sank rapidly down the turning shaft to their level. Its centre flickered weakly with the ghosts of figures and symbols. Around the platform, the walls were starting to tremble. Access architectural configuration. Small segments of masonry began to tumble around him. A crack began to widen in the wall above. In for a penny, in for a pound. The Doctor tightened his fists and ordered, Complete structural reconfiguration. TARDIS Type 40. Return to original template. Send! A painful grating sound. The screen flared white for a moment. The turntable platform juddered in its descent. The remaining stars guttered and several died utterly. Cancel! Choked the Doctor, his throat raw with dust. The grating ceased, but the dimensional gear change had failed to engage. The platform still wound slowly down between the crumbling walls. They were nearing the ground. The Doctor shook his head in disgust. Not enough power! The screen still sank with them. Its frame had paled into the form of an attendant ghost. Localized configuration only, the doctor called. Let's take this gently. Tower staircase section. Extend to whatever you can manage. Send! The remaining stars went out. Silence. Something clicked into place. He heard a distant rumble that grew to a roar. The platform jolted violently. The doctor grabbed Vale and threw himself at the stairway. Behind them, the platform fell apart in a tumble of planks and stone. The stairway's descent stopped. "Hang on tight!" yelled the doctor. The tower walls began to crumble and fall away around them. They clung on to the edges as the stairway went into reverse. Turning at alarming speed, it spiralled up, unsupported, into the darkening air.